Former U.S. Vice President Joe Biden makes a big comeback on Super Tuesday, but there's still a long way to go to determine who will face President Donald Trump in November's election. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The Democratic Party is now divided between a progressive candidate and a moderate. The contest for the Democratic nomination involved nearly 36 candidates at one point. Only a handful are still officially in the race, but just 2 have the best chance of winning the nomination. Joe Biden won most of the Super Tuesday primaries and took over the delegate lead from Senator Bernie Sanders.
So I'm here to report we are very much alive. And make no mistake about it, this campaign will send Donald Trump packing. This campaign is taking off.
To discuss the Democrat race, let's bring in our panel. Here in our studio, Becker is the Executive Director of the Answer Coalition. Joining us from North Carolina, Mary C. Curtis is a columnist for the political publication Roll Call. From California, Spencer Critchley is a strategist for the Democratic Party. And Brice joins us from Michigan. He is the host of the radio show Straight Talk. Welcome to all of you. Let's start with Mary Curtis. Mary Curtis, former Vice President Joe Biden, didn't start off very well, a very shaky start to this primary season, but he's come back roaring. He's made a strong recovery. He took 9 states in Super Tuesday primary elections. What do you think's behind that? To what would you attribute his success?
Well, the turnaround was, of course, the South Carolina primary. When they got to the states after New Hampshire and Iowa, he didn't do very well. Nevada, he started to build. But when he came to a place where there was a large African-American electorate, he really did well because of his relationships. And he owes a lot, actually, to Congressman James Clyburn of South Carolina, who came out right before the primaries with a very heartfelt endorsement. He said, we know Joe, and Joe knows us. And he mentioned his late wife, who is very respected. And almost half of the voters going in said that that meant a lot. And then after that, the campaign got this needed breath of support, fresh air, because Joe Biden's campaign didn't have very much money. They weren't up on the air in Super Tuesday states. They only had 1 field office in Virginia. But all the free media and the attention they got, and it seemed like Joe Biden had a lot more energy. It took them into Super Tuesday, and of course, we see what the results were. And where I am in North Carolina, where I'm also based, he did quite well, even though early polls were showing that it was a 3-way race between Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, and Mike Bloomberg, who put incredible amounts of resources into North Carolina. But Joe Biden won that state and many others.
Mary certainly had a lot of support from much of the mainstream media, but there was one other development, and that was the fact that some of his fellow candidates, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, naming just 2 of them, dropped out just before Super Tuesday and threw their support behind him. What kind of impact did that have?
Oh, that had a great impact as well. Particularly, one of the Super Tuesday states was Minnesota, and Amy Klobuchar gave him a big push. And then Beto O'Rourke in Texas, which is another Super Tuesday state that actually there was some surprise that Joe Biden won it. And then you had Pete Buttigieg who came in, and those supporters in the so-called moderate lane, that actually gave a big boost to his campaign as well.
Brian, what did you make of Tuesday's results?
Well, you know, if you listen to the mainstream media, not only was this a roaring comeback, I would say it's actually more like a resurrection, because the Biden campaign looked completely dead a week ago. He's an incoherent candidate. He can't keep 2 sentences together. He makes stories up. He's talking about things that have been proven to be untrue. He was a failure and a flop. He won in North Carolina, and then President Obama called Pete Buttigieg and basically suggested, probably forcefully, it's time to leave. Amy Klobuchar also left. Beto O'Rourke, as Mary said, came together. And then the most important element of all was the media created the sense of inevitability. If you want to beat Donald Trump, Joe Biden is your man. Bernie Sanders might say things that appeal to you. He may share your values, but he can't win. He's too far left. And so this drumbeat of media coverage from the corporate-owned mainstream media made it possible to Biden to win in Massachusetts. He didn't spend one penny on one ad. He didn't have one campaign office. He didn't have any ground game, but he won Massachusetts. Again, this is free media from the corporate media.
Yeah, Brian, I get your point about, you know, Joe Biden being incoherent at times and saying things that were proven to be not true, but that didn't seem to have resonated with voters. They didn't seem to really care about that.
Well, we went out and campaigned and talked to voters in Virginia, and we said all these things. Do you agree with Bernie Sanders or Biden? A lot of people agreed with Bernie Sanders. What about the fact that he's an incoherent candidate, making stuff up? None of it mattered. There was only one criteria, one metric, one measuring stick was who can beat Donald Trump? And the media convinced a big part of the population who came to vote, and it's mainly older folks who vote in primaries, it's skewed, that the only way to beat Trump was with Joe Biden.
Was this, Brian, a disappointing day for Bernie Sanders?
It would have to be, because Sanders' main path to the nomination, because of the superdelegate problem that he faces, where 525 superdelegates, meaning unelected delegates, not elected from the primaries, are going to vote against him. They're the establishment. The only way he can really win is to have a surge on Super Tuesday coming into the convention, either with a majority or an overwhelming plurality, which would make it impossible for the Democratic Party to use superdelegates to take that nomination from him. That's a setback.
Yeah, he did get the biggest prize, of course, which was California. Go ahead, Mary.
I have to say, I saw President Trump at a rally in Charlotte on Monday night, because he kind of trolls before Super Tuesday states wherever there's going to be a Democratic primary. And he said some things that were pretty incoherent. I would have to say, when he comes to his rallies, the people come mainly to be part of that experience. And he just, you know, it was a bunch of non sequiturs often. He made up a lot of charges. He called people names. And he said things like, you know, we are going to protect your pre-existing conditions, even though his administration is going to court to cut back on the protection for pre-existing conditions. So part of these rallies, when people get together and have their followers say things, you can't exactly say that he's the most coherent candidate.
Right. Spencer Critchley, Biden now has front-runner status. We haven't got all the results in from California yet, but I think he will have a small lead ahead of Bernie Sanders. Where does he go to from here? Can he keep up this momentum?
Well, you know, we've been surprised lots of times already. We should prepare for further surprises ahead, but I think he's actually in a commanding position. As long as he continues to run a campaign the way he was campaigning last week. He had a weak campaign before then, but he really does seem to have woken up and turned it around. I also think that Mary's position on this is supported by the data, and I always favor arguments that are supported by data, not just a good story. There's this narrative emerging of the so-called Democratic establishment being behind the turnaround for Joe Biden. It's not only wrong on the face of it when you look at the data, it's extremely disrespectful to the working and middle-class African-American voters of South Carolina primarily, who saved Joe Biden this past weekend. That's why you saw the cascade of support from Buttigieg and Klobuchar and everybody else. That would not have happened without the predominantly African-American voters of South Carolina. I think that if Democrats speak this way, they are insulting a core coalition that's vital to Democratic victory. It's a mistake they've made before, and it's an example of Democrats, in some cases, analyzing things in terms of economics all the time, you know, social class, and missing culture, which I think is just absolutely crucial here. If Republicans are making that argument, it's just because they're trolling and they're trying to pump up the chances for Sanders, who's what they actually want to run against.
Brian, attributing...
I would agree.
Yeah.
I would agree there. I would say that, you know, these voters in South Carolina, many of those who remember the Voting Rights Act where they couldn't vote, they take their vote very seriously. It's very emotional. So to call them establishment when they are really hardworking people, it is very insulting to them, or say they're somehow manipulated.
Nobody's calling the voters the establishment, but there is a Democratic Party establishment, and it's 100% against Bernie Sanders. There was an interview with 93 superdelegates last week in the New York Times. Not one of them would vote for Bernie Sanders. The media coverage from the pro-democratic media,
are also African-American Party stalwarts.
I mean, it's no disrespect at all to the African-American vote in the South to say that there's a Democratic Party, to say that there's a Democratic Party establishment that favors Joe Biden is somehow disrespectful to voters. That's not true. That's trolling. That's real trolling.
All right, let me get...
there are moderate Democrats. There are moderate Democrats, and they would have gone for Buttigieg, Klobuchar, any of the moderates who emerged as a strong figure. Biden would have been abandoned if he hadn't been able to turn around his campaign, and it is disrespectful to these African-American voters. And this superdelegate thing is another example of it. Many of these superdelegates who people are picturing as these, rich white fat cats, many of them are African-American or they're otherwise working in middle class. They're from a wide variety of different groups. Many of them have been working hard to support their local party organizations for years. That's how they ended up as superdelegates.
Right, I want to get back to the role of superdelegates later, but let me go to Brandon Brice. Brandon, how will the Republicans be looking at the state of the race as far as the Democrats are concerned?
Well, first of all, I think the challenge is, I don't think, we can talk about Joe Biden, but the 6,000-pound gorilla in the room is that, this guy could be in the early stages of dementia. I mean, this guy's campaign 2 weeks ago, the Democratic Party was ready to throw him out. They said the guy can't win. Now there's this resurrection, and I want to give credit to what my colleague said. The black vote is the reason that Joe Biden is still in this race. However, I think, when we're talking about Donald Trump, what makes Donald Trump a unique candidate is this guy literally will use whatever it takes to fight and to win. And I just don't think, unfortunately, Biden's got it in him. But the other thing is that when we talk about a candidate like Bernie Sanders, I think there is something to say about the media. Chris Matthews 2 weeks ago just basically said, if you vote for Bernie, we're going to lose. And then the other factor to that is that, when you talk about the establishment, this is 2016 all over again. It sounds like another Hillary situation where the establishment is saying, this is the guy we want to go with, not the American people.
Mary Curtis, let's look at...
I would point out Chris Matthews had to retire.
Yeah.
Not because of that comment, though. Not because of that comment. He had to retire because
that was part of it.
Of his sexist misogyny towards women employees. That was why.
Be that as it may, it's going to take a lot to defeat Donald Trump. And as you can see, Donald Trump is already gearing his base to say, we're calling him Dementia Joe. I mean, he's already starting and preparing for what he knows will be a challenge in 2020.
Boy, glass houses.
Well, no, but this is the big winner in the Democratic primary on Tuesday was Donald Trump, because Joe Biden can't beat Donald Trump. He can't stand up to him in a debate. He's going to mop the floor with him. And I say that not as a Trump supporter.
Okay, I want to move on to one other thing, Mary Curtis, and that is the former New York Mayor, Michael Bloomberg. A lot of hope was put in his candidacy. He dropped out. He spent $500 million. I mean, does that tell us that actually money can't buy an election, even if you have unlimited?
We learned that with Mitt Romney.
Well,
the reality is
one moment, Brandon, I'll get to you. Mary, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yes. Yeah. $500 million. He did win American Samoa. What he has said, though, is that he will put his money and his organization behind Joe Biden. And he does have an incredible system around the country. As I said, I can see here of all the offices he has. And if he turns that over, plus his social media and his marketing team to Biden, that will help him. But indeed, I wrote a couple of weeks ago in Roll Call that if he was the savior for the Democrats, that would be a problem for their future, because obviously a lot of young people would not vote for Michael Bloomberg, particularly if they felt he was coming in to rig the election.
Yeah.
Black and brown folks, particularly with the issue of stop and frisk, they feel he might have apologized, but he didn't really get, as Elizabeth Warren said in a debate, that it was the policy that was itself racist. And so, yeah, he had, and his problems with women, they couldn't exactly attack Donald Trump because of his own problems with NDA. So, yeah, that was a problematic thing from the start. But he has said he would support the candidate. So we'll see what will happen with that. I'm sure Joe Biden will be very happy for that support. Bernie Sanders has said he would not accept it.
Right. Brandon, go ahead.
It's not about the money. It's about the message. And the reality is this constant flow of anything but Donald Trump, it's not going to work with the American people. I mean, already there's this conversation that, well, we want to put our money behind. It's not a money issue. The Democratic candidate and all the presidential candidates that we've seen, they had no message. You know what their message was? Donald J. Trump. And the reality is Donald Trump didn't even have to run. He's getting earned media just from the presidential candidates. And so the challenge is, moving forward with Joe Biden, what is the message? That's what needs to be focused on, not Bloomberg's money.
You know,
I kind of do agree that it will be the message.
agree
And
with that.
also there are some things too. You have to say what you are for and what you will do. And even with the African American vote, they're very pragmatic, as we said earlier. And more than most folks, they see an existential threat in the presidency. They're not a monolith, obviously, in the presidency of a Donald Trump.
Right.
And there's also the wild card of some things that you don't know what will happen in the news. Something in foreign affairs might happen. We see the coronavirus that has had, we didn't know that was coming down. How will the administration handle that? Will people feel safe?
All right.
So I think it's a little early to say what is going to happen and who even the candidate will be, because you just never know.
Spencer, to Mary's point, would it be fair to say that we don't know what Joe Biden's policies are or what he will do in many important things like healthcare, for instance, climate change? He hasn't really enunciated that, has he?
I think we do, but I agree with Brian that it's a mistake that Democrats frequently make to lead with policy. I've been writing about this as well as the other topic about the so-called Democratic establishment at my blog at spencercritchley.com. I think this is a crucial problem with Democrats, is they're way too much in their heads. They're really strong on substance and they're terrible at branding, whereas Trump is exactly the reverse. He has no substance whatsoever, but he's brilliant at branding. And Biden, if he's the front runner, anybody who's running against him needs to be able to say not what they stand for in terms of policy, but who they are in terms of character and values. And they need to be able to say that in a phrase. They need to be able to say it just by their presence. This is one of the things that Obama was very strong at, and Trump in his way is very strong at it. And this is really, it makes the crucial difference.
Yeah, it's a key point.
You
Brian?
could see that at the Trump rally.
I'll get to you, Mary.
You can see that at the Trump rally.
I'll get you in a
You
moment,
can see that
Mary.
at the Trump rally.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Joe Biden stands for the status quo. He's got a long record. He's been in the U.S. Senate since 1973. We know his record. It's not a mistake. It's not an accident. He supported the Iraq War.
I want to stop you right there, Brian, because we did get an indication of where Bernie Sanders is taking his campaign. Listen to this. Watch this.
One of us in this race led the opposition to the war in Iraq. You're looking at him. Another candidate voted for the war in Iraq. One of us has spent his entire life fighting against cuts in Social Security, wanting to expand Social Security. Another candidate has been on the floor of the Senate calling for cuts to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and Veterans programs.
So we have Bernie Sanders going on the attack there.
Yeah, last night. Yeah.
Why didn't he do this weeks ago?
Right. Perhaps he should have. I think he discounted Joe Biden, but because, again, everybody thought Joe Biden was dead. He was losing. He had no money. He was incoherent on the stage. The sudden resurrection of Joe Biden when I believe the Democratic Party establishment realized that unless they stopped Bernie Sanders on Super Tuesday, if he swept that, he would be unstoppable at the convention. So they all rallied behind the establishment. I'm not talking about the voters. The voters are also getting the message that there's unity behind this person, Joe Biden. But he has a track record on the Iraq War. He was the author of the Criminal Justice Reform Bill, which led to mass incarceration or contributed to it greatly in 1994. He stopped Anita Hill from having witnesses come and testify on her behalf in Clarence Thomas's confirmation hearing. We know Joe Biden. Perhaps Bernie Sanders, instead of being the benevolent, let's all work together to defeat Donald Trump, had actually exposed Joe Biden's program more, he would have done better. I think he should have. But again, Bernie Sanders, I think, took the situation for granted.
Sorry, Mary, you go ahead. You wanted to say something.
No, I was just going to say with the branding issue, when I was at the Trump rally, he was repeating these phrases, still, build a wall, Mexico's going to pay for it. So as your earlier guest was saying, he can do the branding. So they're going to have to, as you say, have someone who can counter it. People would say religious freedom. I thought someone like a Pete Buttigieg was doing very well with saying that God is not a Republican or a Democrat, and he talked about his faith. These kinds of ways where people reach to the heart and they are able to brand themselves, I think the Democrats could learn from doing that. And as your guest, when he was rolling out the crime bill and things like that, well, of course, people can talk about Trump's history on those same things. He might talk about the First Step Act, but he has a history of racial provocation, whether it was the Central Park exonerated 5 or discriminating against people of color in his housing, or the things he has said about communities of color. So there's going to have to be some people to, you know, the people who like Trump say they like a fighter.
Yeah.
Democrats are going to have to fight if they want it. So, I mean, I agree.
Brandon, when President Trump talks about, continues to talk about building the wall, when he talks about the crackdown on immigration, etc., is that something that he believes resonates with his base?
Well, here's the reality. Let's look at numbers for a minute. The nation is about 65% white American, white female. And so he understands one thing that makes him different is that not only does this president understand his base, but whereas many politicians run away from the camera, Donald Trump actually runs towards it, and he grabs it by the neck. And so the challenge is that, when you take somebody like a Bernie Sanders, who may not be electable, but he's a fighter, he's got a movement, the Democratic Party, once again, going back to messaging, is what's going to be key when they talk about how do you defeat Donald Trump on a national stage, where at the end of the day, I mean, Donald Trump literally has called every politician that has ever challenged him something hilarious, and he's an entertainer. He is what you call a candidate for infotainment. But let me also say this before I close.
Yeah.
What is going to make the biggest difference here if Joe Biden gets the nomination, because we know he's got some health issues where now people are questioning, is Joe Biden fit to lead? The biggest question will be who he picks as his vice president. That is going to be critical. And right now, I couldn't tell you who could defeat this current White House administration.
Spencer, what do you make of that question that Brandon poses? How do you take on Donald Trump on the national stage? I mean, this is the president, as Brandon just points out, who's got a name for everybody.
Yeah. I actually think if Joe Biden, continues with his present sense of energy and focus, I also think, by the way, another critical thing that's probably happening is changes of staff, which is an unseen component that can make a huge difference. I noticed Jen O'Malley Dillon got hired to do field organizing in Nevada, which I think might be an example of the kind of turnaround that could be happening. But if Joe can focus his message and focus on the energy, one thing I say is that political campaigns, especially presidential ones, are more mythological than logical. And on that level, Biden would be the Prince of Light, basically, against Trump's Prince of Darkness. He can be the hope candidate. He can have the same kind of common touch that Trump does, the heart and gut connection that is a natural talent of his. It's why he's so widely beloved. But as a good guy. I mean, I think a lot of people support Trump because they live in a world that makes them afraid and suspicious, and they think, well, it's the classic old thing, he's a son of a you-know-what, but at least he's our son of a you-know-what. But if you have somebody who can come along with the same touch and the same sense of strength and focus, and he's going to fight for me, and he's a good guy, people always prefer that.
Mary, can Joe Biden count on African-American support right until the end, until the election? Because as Brian pointed out a moment ago, as others have pointed out as well, I mean, his record could be a bit of a liability, couldn't it? He was the author of that omnibus criminal bill that led to mass incarceration. He boasts that he wrote that bill. There's also his call for cuts to Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. He voted for the Iraq War. He supported NAFTA, which led to the loss of many jobs.
Well, as I said, African-American voters are not monolithic, but they are pragmatic because they've had to choose from some very bad choices.
Are pragmatic
issues. They do know Joe Biden, and they also know Donald Trump, and he has a record that is very problematic, as I said earlier, when it comes to communities of color. I grew up in Baltimore, which he called a rat-infested place where no human is fit to live, and so they know these things. And there is a loyalty because Joe Biden was the vice president to the first black president of the United States of America, Barack Obama. That means a lot, particularly older black voters, that this white man worked for and supported a young black man who could be his son. They also see Donald Trump tearing down a lot of the legacy of Obama. And that's a very emotional issue and very personal. And some of the things that Obama put through, they were very supportive of. So they see him carrying on that legacy. So I'm not saying that, they will come through for him all the time, but that is very huge. And, Barack Obama in 2012 won with 39% of the white vote. But he won because he got energized so many other parts of the electorate that perhaps had not voted before to come out, young people, people of color, all across the board. And so you cannot forget that as well. And suburban white women, many of them, came out in this Super Tuesday for Joe Biden because, as your previous guest said, they don't like the style. They might like some pieces of it, but when you have to shoo your kids out of the room when the president comes on, that's, if they can have, as he said, a little bit of light to a darkness, I think that might be the key. As I said, there's always an unexpected thing.
One moment, Brian. Brendan, go ahead, and I'll get to you, Brian.
I just want to say, the challenge here is that Joe Biden is no Barack Obama. And I think it would be very flawed to assume that black people, because he was the vice president to the first African-American president, are going to take a chance on Joe Biden. I think they're looking at the fact that this is a guy who, Clyburn got behind, and a lot of the African-American establishment is getting behind. But I think we got to be very clear to separate the establishment from the progressive and moderate African Americans in this nation.
Okay, go ahead, Brian.
And there's also the generational issue. I mean, young people of all races were voting for Bernie Sanders, enthusiastic about Bernie Sanders.
They don't seem to have voted in this in the Super Tuesday primaries.
But those who voted, the primaries are skewed towards an older demographic. So how can a Democrat beat Donald Trump without energizing a big part of the base, which is young voters? That's what Obama did in 2008. Bernie Sanders has been doing it in 2016 and 2020. Young people, by the way, in 2016, 6 million Democrats didn't show up at the polls. 6 million Democrats, including those who did come to the polls, some of whom voted for Obama, then voted for Trump. So I don't see how the Democrats win without young people. There's a generational issue. Yes, a lot of older people have an affinity with Joe Biden. That's not true for young folks.
Okay, and we have to bring it to an end.
That VP will be very important. I will be really looking to see if he gets someone that can energize them. That'll be crucial.
We got to go. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter. That's at CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching. Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists and others. It's a fresh, focused and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict or US politics, The Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find The Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search The Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.